So we're talking about the populist revolt and picking up where we did last week, which is kind of our thing. And what we talked about last week was the problem that all these people here had, which is the problem of cotton. In the aftermath of the Civil War, as people are growing more cotton than Texas ever has. Right? I gave you guys some really big numbers last time for just how much cotton Texas is growing, and it's astounding the production levels that go up. The problem is prices keep going down. You guys remember this from last week, right? From 16 cents a pound right here in the late 1860s, just steady march into the floor. By the time you get to the mid 1890s, it's 5 cents a pound, which creates massive problems, right? And so when I teach in my class about this era, I talk a lot about what I called last week the problem of cotton. But as I said last week, the problem of cotton is actually three problems rolled into one to make an extra terrible, hard problem, right? The first part of that is collapsing cotton prices, right? So you're making less and less money every year. And that leads to major cotton problem number two, is that people start losing their land. And I showed you guys this this map last week where sharecropping is going on, which is sort of the worst of economic situations you can be as a farmer. You can see Texas is in kind of the worst categories because it has the highest rates of sharecropping across the American South. But people are losing their land. They're becoming tenant farmers, which means they're renting it and paying a share of their crop, or they're sharecroppers working for somebody else for just a share of whatever this is at the end of the year. None of which really works out. So farmers get into dire straits because of collapsing cotton prices. Then they lose their land and they don't know what to do about it. As we talked about last week, they try to get help. They form organizations like the Grange that come up with their 3-point plan for solving the problem of cotton. And then they run into the other major obstacle that is facing farmers at this time, which is politicians in the state capital, Texas, who don't care. Well, maybe it's not fair to say they don't care. They're not going to do anything about it, whether they care or not. Maybe the way to think about it, right? Because one of the things we talked about last week is that after the Civil War, after Reconstruction in particular, right? And this is how we tie units together, right? Which is a very powerful thing for our students, where they can see something they learned earlier having a payoff later. But at the end of Reconstruction, the former Confederates, the Democrats in Texas, run the Republicans out of Texas. And when they do that, it's basically just a one-party state. Only the Democrats are in charge. These guys who called themselves the Redeemers because they had, quote unquote, redeemed Texas from the misrule, as they called it, of the Republicans during Reconstruction. All right. These guys never lose elections because they're the only game in town. They're the only party you can vote for. So these governors, we talked about these guys, Richard Koch, Orrin Roberts, Sol Ross. These guys win elections with 60, 70, 80% of the votes, right? So the point is, they don't have to listen to anybody. And so when the farmers come to them and say, we need you to help us, we need the state to start regulating the economy, these guys say no, right? And that means the farmers are in major trouble. And that's what leads to the populist revolt. All right. So our essential question, it's going to guide the first half here of our excitement, is how does this all lead up to the populists? How were the populists a political revolt in reaction to this? And why is that going to matter so much? Right. So the story of the lead to the populist revolt is what we just talked about. The problem of cotton just keeps getting worse. I love this graph because it shows how much worse things can get. You know, when it gets down into the red, that means it's costing the farmers more to grow the cotton than they're getting when they sell it at market. All right. And so you can see by the late 1880s, it's all in the red. And then by the mid 1880s, it's going to be just deep into the red. All right. So the farmers keep doing what they've been doing. Right? They form self-help groups like the Farmers Alliance, formed in Texas in 1876. And the Farmers Alliance picks up where the Grange left off. We talked about this last week, where they come up with a 4-point plan about how they're going to solve these problems. And we talked about all these different things. I'm not going to go through them. But the commonality here, it's important to emphasize to our students, right? It's not the details of the sub-treasury plan or regulating the railroad. The commonality, the big picture here is that these farmers feel desperate, they need help, and they want the state to act in some way on their behalf, to regulate the economy, right? And they think that this will happen because there's, by the early 1890s, there's so many farmers in such desperate straits that they're starting to affect the political situation, right? And we saw this in 1891 with the election of James Hogg as the first native Texan to be governor of Texas, right? And this is where we left off the story with Hogg, because Hogg gets elected in 1891 as governor of Texas by promising the farmers that he would do things to help them the way no other politician had. He promised to regulate the railroads, for example, by setting up a railroad commission, right? And he hints that he might do more. So he gets elected in 1894, promising that he's going to help the farmers, right? And when he gets elected, he does set up a railroad commission, but he only puts Democrats on it. He won't put any of these Farmers Alliance guys on the railroad commission. And so it doesn't do a whole lot. It does regulate the railroad some, but not the way the farmers really want. And then the real breaking point is that the farmers then say, well, what about our sub-treasury plan? If you guys remember that from last week, the warehouse plan, right? That takes a lot of government intervention. And what does James Ferguson say to that? He says, no, you're crazy. There's no way we're doing that. And this is the breaking moment, because when James Ferguson says, no, I'm not going to do that, what he's saying is, I'm not going to help you guys as farmers the way you want us to be helped. All right. I'm still a Democrat. I'm still the, inheritor of the Redeemers and the small government sort of perspective that came out of Reconstruction amongst a lot of ex-Confederates. And so James Hogg says, no, I'm not going to do that. All right. The farmers take this hard. And what they realize in all this, and this is why this is a political revolt, what the farmers realize is that they're never going to win playing with the Democrats. They're never going to win in that system, because the Democrats are never going to listen to them, really. They might say they would to defeat other Democrats in the primary, but there's just one party, the Democrats. You're never going to beat them. So if you really want to change things, if you really want to shake things up, you've got to go outside the system and start a little political revolution. And that's what forms the Populist Party, or the People's Party, as they call it. All right. So you guys, I showed this picture last week. This is them in 1891 in Omaha, Nebraska, where they established the People's Party. Texans are at the helm of doing all this, because the Populist Party is not just a Texas thing. It's a South and the West, and actually some people from the North, coming together to form kind of a workers' party more than anything else, made up heavily by farmers. And, this cartoon, I think, gives a really good example of how angry and upset a lot of the farmers and laborers in general were feeling in the United States in this last half of the 19th century, that they're being sacrificed, in this case, literally crucified on a cross of gold by, in this case, the Republican Party and corporations and all that sort of stuff. I'm sure someone has a good answer for this. I've never figured out why Napoleon is coming out of this guy's pocket over here, but it gives you a good sense of just how angry they are, right? And so the Populists come up with a lot of solutions, right? The Farmers Alliance had a 4-point plan. The Populists aren't that organized. They don't have like a 4 or 5-point plan, but they got a lot of ideas. And I always list these for students, and we go through some of them, like getting rid of national banks, because that's helping, railroads and things like that. An income tax. They wanted an income tax not because they thought they would be charged on the income tax. They thought that would charge all the really rich guys at the very top. That's why they wanted that. But the thing I want to point out to you about what the Populist Party was advocating for that's important are these last two at the bottom. You see this? What they wanted more than anything else was government control of all forms of transportation and communication. So they don't want to just regulate the railroad. They do. But they want to regulate, in addition to that, telegraphs, this newfangled thing called the telephone that may or may not catch on. They want government intervention in regulating all of that stuff, because they feel like the farmers are just getting screwed by the railroads, by the prices that are being communicated over telegraphs, and that they're being left out. So the government needs to step in and defend farmers, is their idea. And then the next thing is what they're most famous for, which is free silver, which is the same thing the Farmers Alliance was saying, which is abandon the gold standards. Just different ways of saying the same thing. Bimetallism is a common term. But basically, they wanted to expand the money supply and get beyond just gold backing U.S. currency. Why? We talked about that last week. And it comes down to basically making money cheaper, which helps lower debts, and that's good for farmers who have a lot of debts, is their basic idea. But what I tell students they need to remember about that is that it is, again, asking the government, in this case, the federal government probably, to regulate the economy, because it's the federal government that's going to be the one that decides, are we using gold? Are we using silver? Are we using both? Like, this is deep intervention by the government in the U.S. economy in a way that it never had on this level before, right? That is what the populists are asking for, right? And this made them a nightmare for the guys I like to call the redeemers in places like Texas. These ex-Confederates, or in some cases their kids, Democrats in the one-party state in Texas, these guys who had, quote, redeemed Texas and claimed it and were controlling it. The populists were a nightmare for the redeemers in places like Texas. Why? Well, one, as I just keep saying, they're asking for active government to solve major problems facing farmers. And if there's one thing that the ex-Confederates had learned coming out of Reconstruction, is they don't want the government doing anything. They can help it. They don't want an active government on a big scale. So that's a no-go for them, right? So these guys who've been in charge in Texas, when the farmers go to them, they go, no, we told you no with the Farmers Alliance. We told you no with the Grange. And when you guys are calling yourself populists, it's just the same thing with a different hat on it. And I'm not interested. So these guys just say no, all right? But then here's the other kicker, all right? The populists were a little different because the populists were not just white farmers. The populists were also African-American farmers. And so what you have with the Populist Party is a real game changer, is it's a biracial coalition, right? And that's a big deal, all right? Up until this point, Black farmers and white farmers facing the same problems, growing cotton, all of them, getting poorer for it, although in the case of free African-Americans, sometimes they're building some level of wealth and stability that they hadn't had before. But white farmers didn't want to work with Black farmers because of just straight up racism. And Black farmers didn't trust white farmers for all the reasons you can imagine. But by the time you get to the 1890s, the populists decide that maybe these two sides can work together. Why? Well, African-American farmers have the same problems as white farmers with all these problems happening with cotton. So they need the same solutions. And white farmers need as many votes as they can possibly get if they're going to challenge the political system. Does that make sense? They're trying to challenge the status quo. So they need more votes than ever. And getting Black voters, men, to vote, because this is before the 19th Amendment, will help them. So it's an alliance. Now, I don't want to say that they're like all buddy-buddy and on the same page about everything. It's an uneasy alliance, but it is definitely a biracial coalition in many cases, especially in places like Texas, right? That's going to make these guys mad too. They don't like that either, all right? Like take the guy on the right here. You see this guy who looks like Santa Claus? Okay, that's Oren Roberts. He was the chair of the secession convention that took Texas out of the United States at the Civil War. He was a colonel in the Confederacy. He then helps write an early constitution for Texas when it comes back in the Union that specifically outlaws any rights for African Americans because Oren Roberts said, quote, we need to preserve this for a white man's government. All right. My point simply being that the powerful Democrats in Texas, the ex-Confederates in Austin, wanted nothing to do with a biracial coalition of people asking for active government. So they say no to the farmers. And so the farmers say, well, then fine, we'll have our political revolution. And they have the Populist Party. They nominate this guy, James Weaver, as their candidate for president, which, as you can see, he has the main qualification you needed in the late 19th century to run for political office, which is to say a beard. All these guys are bearded. My friend used to call this the age of bearded presidents. Anyway, he runs for president as the populist candidate. He's running against the establishment, which is the Democrats. They nominate Benjamin Harrison, and the Democrats, Grover Cleveland over here. So Republicans, Harrison, Democrats, Cleveland. And Weaver goes out on the campaign trail and he's out there saying, like, hey, don't vote for the normal guys. Vote for this new party you've never heard of before, but we got some good ideas. And he pitches free silver and government regulation on a scale no one's seen before, all that sort of stuff. And poor farmers think it's a great idea. The Democrats in places like Texas think this is horrible, and they try to attack him every chance they get. And if you think political the political landscape is ugly today, and it is. I'm here to tell you it was pretty ugly in the late 1890s as well, where people threw rocks at him. They threw rocks and tomatoes and rotten eggs at his wife at campaign events. They spread rumors that Weaver was Catholic and he was taking secret orders from the Pope as a way of trying to dissuade people from voting for him. The Democrats in Texas did everything they could to try to stop people from voting for Weaver. But then they have the election in November of 1892. And what's amazing about this election is how well the Populists did. Now, I know you know they don't win the presidency. It's Grover Cleveland that's going to win it for the Democrats. So he's in blue here. See that? Benjamin Harrison, he's in red. He's going to lose. But the Weaver with the Populists, look at this. He won 4 whole states, right? When Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho. As the old saying go, how Idaho goes, so goes the country. No, I just made that up. Anyway, they win 4 whole states. They win 1 million votes. They win 10% of the vote nationwide, right? Which my students are never impressed by 10% of the vote when I tell them that. But when I tell them is like, think about that though. If you won 10% of the vote, that's political power on a huge scale, because what happens at the next election? If you can control 10% of the vote, what can you do? You can throw the election one way or the other, right? You don't have to win the election to have incredible influence in the next election. And so the Populists recognize that they're a force that is rising. So if you're taking notes, please write this down. The Populists are rising in influence in 1892. I mean, they were established as a party in July. The election is in November. They'd only been around a few months, and they still win 4 whole states, 1 million votes, and 10% of the vote nationwide. It's astounding. And in places like Texas, they actually won more than you might expect. So look at Texas on this map. It's colored blue because Cleveland won the state, but the Populists still won almost 25% of the vote in Texas. That's nearly a quarter of the vote that they won in Texas. That's massive. They can throw all kinds of elections and they have a big influence going forward. So the Populists, they don't come out of this feeling bad. They come out of this being like, wow, we are onto something. We are up for some serious political influence, and we might actually get things changed the way we've been begging people to listen to us for so long, right? And actually, we can see that in action very quickly, because the election happens in 1892. The next year, 1893, this guy is back up for re-election as governor of Texas, James Hogg. Remember James? All right, well, he had to go up for re-election. He has the nomination, which when you have a nomination, it should be a cakewalk, right? He should get 60, 70, 80% of the vote. In fact, his immediate predecessor had won with 78% of the vote. All right, should be a cakewalk. He gets re-elected, but barely. I mean, by the skin of his teeth does this guy get re-elected. He doesn't even win a majority of the vote. He only wins 44% of the vote. So he gets a plurality of the vote. The Populist candidate won 25% of the vote. So they're catching up. This guy's coming down. The Democrats are losing their power. You can actually see it in play in Texas. This scares the Bojangles out of them, right? It is terrifying to see happen. So this guy barely gets reelected, and then he's done after that. And the Populists feel like they're rising in power, rising in influence in a way they can see on the ground. And then something else happens. There's a horrible depression that happens in 1893, or begins, I should say, in 1893. You guys have all heard of the Depression of 1893, right? No one ever talks about the Depression of 1893 because it's boring, I guess. I don't know why. It's the biggest depression in all of American history, behind only the Great Depression of the 1930s. All right. It is astounding. Absolutely massive. See all these guys? They're leaving a factory in the Northeast because they all got canned because the economy just collapses all at once. Let me give you guys some numbers to illustrate just how bad things get. All right. About 120 railroads go bankrupt, 119 specifically, but about 120 railroads go bankrupt, just kaput. They're gone, done. All right. 600 banks collapse, which we're going to see this again in the Great Depression. But when banks collapse, the economy collapses because they're not lending money. It's like taking the oil out of the engine. Nothing can run. Everything just goes down. All right. At one point, there's 2.5 million people who are unemployed, which I used to tell my students that and they'd roll their eyes. So then I calculated it's 18% unemployment. As a point of comparison, at the Great Depression in 1933, the worst we've ever had was 25% unemployment, which, yes, is worse than this, but not a whole lot more than 18%. So it's just really bad. All right. And my favorite example of that I tell students is that there were over 100,000 people homeless in Chicago in the aftermath of the Depression of 1893. All right. Just economic chaos. Things are falling apart. People are losing their jobs. And when people get mad about the economy, who, I ask you, do they tend to blame? That's right. Whoever's in charge, who's ever in power. All right. And who just got elected president? You guys remember? Yeah, Grover Cleveland, poor guy. So everybody gets mad at Cleveland, but what they really get mad at are the Democrats, which is his party, and who were in charge in Congress. So the Democrats get blamed. Cleveland gets blamed. Everybody's mad. The economy's collapsing. This is bad for the Democrats. All right. How do we know this? Because there's an off-year congressional election the very next year. See how this is like 1 year after another, just boom, 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 boom. Well, in 1894, they had the congressional election. I'll bet none of you have ever talked with your students about the congressional election of 1894. But I'm here to tell you it is the biggest transfer of political power in all of American history, because 113 people lost their jobs in Congress and were replaced by new people who had been elected by angry voters. 113 seats changed hands as Democrats mostly are being thrown out and new people are coming in. A lot of them are Republicans, but some of them are populists. Do you believe that? Populists are getting elected to the US Congress. The world is on fire. What's happening here? All right. Who is that bad for? The Democrats, because they're all looking 2 years ahead to the next presidential election. And who's going to win that one? The Democrats look like things are just falling apart. Who's it good for? Well, it's definitely good for the populists. More immediately, it's good for the Republicans as the other major party. So they nominate this guy who looks very angry to be having his picture taken, William McKinley. All right. He looks stunned. Like, what is that camera thing you're doing? Stop it. Anyway, they nominate the Republicans, McKinley. And McKinley's only job is to not say anything. Just be quiet and let the voters be mad at the Democrats, and we'll just win the election like a cakewalk. All right. The populists are also watching this going, oh my goodness, the Democrats are falling to pieces. We might really make some advances. We might elect senators. We might elect people at a very high scale, right? And then the Democrats, things get even worse for them, because Grover Cleveland then announces that he's not running for re-election in 1896, which you can't really blame Grover from saying, I don't want to do that. That sounds like a terrible idea. But what it meant was that the Democrats don't have a standard bearer. They don't have an obvious candidate. So they're sitting there going, who do we get? Who are we going to pick? And so we get to this moment in 1896, all right, where the populists are rising and the Democrats are falling in places like Texas. And it almost looks like they're going to pass each other. And the populists are going to rise to this prominence they've never had. And then when you feel that tension the most is in this picture. You guys see this? This is the Democratic nominating convention of 1896, where all these people are going to decide who their presidential nominee is going to be in 1896. They don't have a clue. This is back in the day when we actually picked the nominee at the convention. Today, the convention is just kind of a coronation for someone who's already been picked by the time you get there. But back then, they actually made the choice here. And what you see in this picture is pandemonium. People screaming and yelling at each other, panicking because they feel like they don't know who they can put up there that can win in 1896. And in places like Texas, they're terrified of the populists rising to prominence and power. All right. How it's going to play out, we'll talk about after Chassidy gives you a chance to give you guys some great resources. So I'm going to pause there, hand the mic over to my dear friend Chassidy. She's going to walk you guys through some stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Torget. Let me share my screen with you all. Share. Okay, let's see. I need somebody's face. Thumbs up. Crystal, you're always my thumbs up person. Can you see it? All right, great. Thank you. Awesome. So, as per usual, we have a lesson plan for the first half of this lecture, and it has some activities in it. What I wanted to take some time, though, is to kind of just go through it with some 7th grade teacher speak for those of you taking notes. Because it's really important. This time period, as I mentioned during our first webinar, was that this is the time where everything gets all confusing. And Dr. Torget mentioned it last week, and I think he's going to mention it again today in his notes. Like, we have to put this in perspective that all of this has happened in a very short period of time. And so, and going back and doing research and combing textbooks and combing all these resources, this topic that we're talking about today is like, right now, it's just a little blip. And so I see some people shaking their heads. In several of the books, literally the populist movement is like half of a page insert, right? And so in doing the research for tonight, I kept thinking, like, what is that? And that really sort of aligns with this idea that there's so much happening at one point in period of time. But then if we really think about why is it unique to this time period, if we kind of go backwards, American history, Texas history was always, when you're talking about it from one perspective, right? The settler colonial period was really long. There's a lot to cover there. It's really kind of talked about from one angle. But then when we get to this post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction period, history branches off. And it's no longer this sort of monolithic settler colonial dialogue. It's multiple people, and populations have split. So now you start to see different classes of people emerging. You have African Americans who were, the enslaved for the vast majority of the history. At this point now they're freed people, but now they're freed people in different lived experiences. And then there's Native Americans. And so I came to the conclusion that the reason why they don't say much about what's happening is because there's too much to say. There's too much to say. So we're going to just kind of pare it down, whittle it down to kind of make it as simple as possible. And so that's just kind of my high horse. I really firmly believe that this is a great, great point in the curriculum to not necessarily get bogged down in the weeds, but to really get students to understand how eras and periods overlap and how experiences connect and cross over, particularly when we're talking about the lived experience of all these different people. So with that, I'm going to show you the first item. Someone emailed me after week 1 because I had shown this little like pic collage of Indian wars and how you can use that. And so what I decided to do is build it out for essentially the entire webinar series. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how I would use that. And so we have a little activity here called connecting the dots across the eras. In the teacher notes and in the lesson plan, see if I can zoom it up. I put some questioning prompts that can be used, but essentially what I did was I built out these photo collages for each of these time periods, right? So whether you do this as a gallery walk, you can provide this to students digitally. There's really 2 questions. It's what is the date range and what major issue or idea is taking place during this time period? And so kids can really talk about it. They can, I know I've done this as a chalk talk where these are on chart paper and students are writing, sharing their ideas. They rotate and add things to it. But I think what's most powerful are some of the activities that I kind of wrote at the bottom. And so what we really want to get our students to think about is how do the events from, let's say, and I'm going to test this out with you guys. So I'm going to tag someone. And I see Todd. Todd is always ready. Todd, you're going to be it. But like, so let's say you're in Todd's group and the first placard you're studying is this, right? So we could use the chat for this. So if you were students and I showed you this placard with these images, you can guess the date range. So go ahead and feel free to jot it down in the chat based on what you see, based on what you know, based on what you've learned. What time period, what date range do you think is this? And then what major ideas, issues were taking place? And so that would be the first round if we were going to do this in phases, okay? And then the second round, you can pick any of the questions that are in the first slide. This is really the teacher notes, and pair it with another placard. So round two, let's say I'm going to go back to Indian Wars here, okay? So think about this placard. What is the date range? What major issues or ideas are taking place during this time period? So then you give students time to do their thing, talk about it, jot it down, write it out. Once students have had a chance to engage with at least two of the placards, that's when I would start facilitating some teacher talk, right? Some structured conversation. And so one of the questions, so if I showed you this slide, and I'm going through this quickly, and then this slide, okay? Everybody got it? All right, great, head nods. My question that I want us to talk about in the chat is, how do the events from this period, everybody got it? I see Nancy studying it real hard, connect to any of the ideas and issues of this period? And then I'm going to pick on Todd. Todd, if you could unmute and share your thoughts.
When I look at this, what I see is an expansion of those in power taking advantage of those who aren't in power. And that kind of overlaps in that Native wars start, well, they really start before the Civil War, but they go until 1880s, 1890s almost. And that's around the same time that the Populist are coming on.
Very good, thank you. So Todd gave us a really high level answer, which is he made that connection from a social standpoint, like there's groups that are being infringed upon and taken advantage of. That's perfect. So these are just some talking points for you as a teacher to facilitate that dialogue. And I created these placards for you so they're ready to go. Feel free to print, modify them, however you choose to, but they are your parting gift for this entire speaker series for you to have these placards. The second item that I threw in there, this one can either be used as a primary source analysis, or it could be split into two. You could use it as a hook and a primary source analysis, but I like them together. At first they were separate, but I really like them together. And the first one is this flag, which is very telling. It kind of leads into the populist movement. And so I put it alongside some visual analysis questions where the students are kind of studying the flag, obviously. When was it created? What does it stand for? But then they kind of do this round robin through the quadrants and really sort of dissect and analyze, what do each of those quadrants mean? What do they represent? And what does it symbolize about what's taking place during that time period? And so this flag was super important. This, again, could be a good hook activity, but I paired it with these two newspaper excerpts that are all talking about the Colored Farmers Alliance, okay? And then there are some analysis questions to go along with the excerpts. And then finally, a critical thinking activity. that really gets students thinking about the Farmers Alliance and its transition into the Populist Party. Why did they do that, and what benefit did it serve them? And so that's the second and third, because depending on how you choose to use it, I put them in one document. And then lastly, I saved this because I know this is Jay's portion and going into Dr. Torget's second section. But one of the conversations that we had in planning this is the African American experience during this time period. Because I have Texas history textbooks stacked up next to my desk. We go from emancipation, Reconstruction, and then a little bitty thing about the Colored Farmers Alliance, and then Jim Crow. But that's like a 40-year run. And the question is, well, what is happening to the freed people during this time period? And not just the freed people in Texas, but like the freed people as a whole, right? And so just a few teacher considerations. This is a great time to revisit. If you talk about freedmen's towns at all during Reconstruction, like that's what's happening during this period. During the 1880s, 1890s, we're seeing a population boom of freedmen's towns across mostly East Texas, Southeast Texas area, where these freedmen's towns, it's really a form of de facto segregation. They're really only the laws put in place for the Black Codes and the Homestead Act of Texas, which prevented them from living and purchasing property and acquiring property where white citizens lived. But that those laws were really de facto. They moved into their own settlements, and they were self-sufficient, and they were thriving, and they had their own economies and things of that nature. We also, Dr. Torget had in one of his last slides about Chicago, there's also a mass migration of folks from that part of the country into Texas. And these are freed people who are coming to Texas to be sharecroppers, right? So students typically think, oh, slavery is over. They must have all just left and went north or gone to California. And that's actually not the case. You have a huge influx of freed African Americans coming into Texas to prosper from growing cotton, or they think that this is it. I'm going to be rich. I'm going to have my own community. And it doesn't really work out that way. But that also sort of helps students understand why populism was so popular amongst Black farmers. Because the same thing that they were fighting for was the same things that African Americans, poor white farmers were fighting for. And so I'll stop there in my share.
Thank you, Chassidy. Actually, that was a brilliant segue, because I couldn't agree with you more. I would tell my students, after the Civil War, Texas is one of the top places to go for poor whites and for newly freed, newly emancipated African Americans. It was Texas and Mississippi, which you usually don't think of Mississippi as a land of opportunity, but Texas and Mississippi were the two places that had huge influx of people. And as you said, Chassidy, you're absolutely right. We don't usually get a chance to talk about the African American experience enough in general this whole period, but specifically related to the populist movement and how this was appealing to lots of different people for lots of different angles, all trying to better their lives, right? So populism represents this moment of opportunity, but as you guys know, it doesn't work. And gets us to essential question number 2. Why did the populists fail? And why did that have such a large effect on Texas? Because it is bigger than just the populists failing. That's one of the things we're going to talk about here in a second. Is, again, one of the themes you guys will hear is connecting things across all these different pieces. And so what I'm going to try to do here is talk about not just the failure of the populists, but why that continues to matter, specifically when it comes to the African-American experience in Texas, right? And this is building on everything that we've been talking about. So Chassidy just pointed to this big influx of people. We've been talking about that big influx of people, right? Going from 1870, there's 800,000 people, to by the 1890s, there's 2.2 million people in Texas. And there'll be 3 million by 1900, all right? A massive influx that changes everything. And this is one of the big stories of this era. It's called Cotton, Cattle, and Railroads, right? But it's really people showing up in massive numbers, a lot because of the railroad. And that opens up all kinds of opportunities for African Americans and poor whites coming into Texas, but it also destroys the opportunities for Native Americans. opening up the plains for all kinds of things, including cotton cultivation, but also the cattle industry, right? And all these things are happening simultaneously on top of each other. But it's again cotton that is the most commonly felt experience, right? And so it's all these guys here that represent the vast majority of Texans, white and black, who are experiencing all these downsides. And this is where we get back to the Democratic Convention of 1896, right? Where the Democratic Party is in free fall. The populists are ascending. Democrats are trying to figure out what are they going to do? How are they going to save themselves from losing the 1896 election? How can they possibly find a candidate who could lead them forward? And on the second day of the convention, somebody stands up, William Jennings Bryan, and gives a speech. And William Jennings Bryan, he was 36 years old at the time. He was a politician from Illinois, very, very effective speaker, right? In an era before YouTube, for television, before any form of entertainment really of any kind besides horse racing, being a good speaker really puts you up a head and shoulders above everybody else. And he could command a room. He would give speeches for hours and hours, and people loved it. So he's a really great talker. And he gets up on the stage and he gives a speech, which is often called the Cross of Gold speech, where he basically says, we got to expand the money supply, baby. We got to bring in free silver, bimetallism, whatever you want to call it. Just not just base the money supply on gold, right? Let's do silver too, right? Now, whose idea is that, everybody? Say it with me. The populists, right? Thank you. Yes, it's the populists. So what has he done? He has taken a populist idea and he's introduced it to the Democrats. And he's saying, hey, what do you guys think? This is an idea, right? And the Democrats at the convention go, wait a second. This is brilliant. He's saying populist things, but he's a Democrat. It's like that. It's like the Grinch. And he keeps like at the end where he's like saying they're still up. Forget it. I'm going to drop that one. But like he is saying he's saying populist things. He's a Democrat. So the Democrats will vote for him. And if he's saying populist things, maybe the populists will vote for him. So the idea becomes, what if we nominate William Jennings Bryan for president and try to co-opt the populists, right? What if we have him as our nominee? We'll get Democrat votes and we'll get populist votes, and then maybe we can possibly win the election. It's not a great plan, all right, but it's the only one they've got, all right? So the Democrats nominate this guy, William Jennings Bryan, for president, saying populist things. And that produces a real conundrum for the populists, right? And I ask my students this question, and it's a great question to ask your students if you set this up, all right? What should the populists do? Because they basically got two options. Option one, they can go it alone like they've been going, nominate their own guy for president. The problem is, if the Democratic candidate is saying populist things and the populist guy is saying populist things, it's going to split the vote for the populists, and they're probably going to get fewer votes and therefore win fewer races, okay? That's not good. But the other option is that then you, as a populist, endorse the Democratic candidate. If the populists endorse the Democratic candidate, well, they have an upside there, because if he wins and he has a real chance of winning, then they might get everything they've been asking for. Like if they've got a president who's been saying free silver, man, that'd be great. But the potential downside is terrifying, because if the populists join the Democratic Party, that was called fusion, if you've ever heard that term in the 19th century. They fused themselves to the Democratic Party. They'd lose their own identity. They'd stop being their own party. Like it's all or nothing. If they join the Democrats, they'll either win it all or they'll lose everything, because they will stop being distinct. Because their whole idea is that they were challenging the system. But if they join the system, then they better win or they'll lose it all. All right. So the Democrats nominate William Jennings Bryan. The populists decide, what should we do? They have their own convention. They scream and yell at each other. It's really fierce. The populists recognize this is kind of an all or nothing decision they're making. And ultimately, they decide to join the Democrats because the populists will also nominate William Jennings Bryan as their candidate for president. So you can see here at the bottom, William Jennings Bryan, comma, Democrat, and then below that. And he's now a populist too, because the populists say, you're our guy. So watch my hand. This is amazing. All right. I figured this out. They join together. See that? This is data visualization happening. They join together. And that's good for the Democrats. No bones about it. Risky for the populists. So it's all going to ride on this guy right here, William Jennings Bryan. Can he do it? Can he bring home the presidency? Well, he's going to try really hard, and they're going to say it with populist ideas. So see here, this is obviously a campaign poster for Bryan and Arthur Sewall. That's exciting. And you can see at the top, it says gold and silver coinage. This is bimetallism, as it was called, free silver, populist idea, farmers alliance idea. This is everything they'd hoped for, all right? So he's going to hit the campaign trail. And he does, man. He is out there. He is on what we often use this phrase now, but it was real then, a whistle-stop tour where he's on a train that's just traveling down the tracks, and that's stopping every rinky-dink little town you can imagine. Like, look at this image right here. Look at this. So you see the train over here? Like William Jennings Bryan came in on that train, and they announced in the newspapers ahead of time, hey, on Saturday at 2 o'clock, William Jennings Bryan's going to be here. He's going to talk for hours. You know how exciting that was to farmers to know someone was going to talk for hours? They would get in their little buggy and come running into town. Look at this crowd. Everyone's got a hat on, but they are super excited about being here for William Jennings Bryan. He'd get up there and he'd talk forever, and he'd give these great speeches and all that sort of stuff. And they just loved it. And he's trying to convince them. Vote for me. Vote for the Democratic nominee, right? He covered 26 states, 250 cities, 18,000 miles by rail car. I mean, he is out there hoofing it every which way he can go, all right? William McKinley, he just kind of sat on his porch the whole time, because his whole job is to basically do nothing. His job is to just shut up, don't say anything, let the Democrats destroy themselves, and he basically doesn't even campaign. Now, there's a lot of campaigning on his behalf. The Republicans put out a lot of money in the campaign and try to do everything they can, but McKinley just sort of sits there on his porch. And turns out sitting on your porch was enough to win the presidency in 1896, because William Jennings Bryan does his best. He's in the blue here, but McKinley and the Republicans, who are in the red, they're the ones that ultimately win. But William Jennings Bryan, he does better than you might have thought he would do. He polls, what does he take? He takes about 6.5 million votes. And McKinley polls about 7.1 million, roughly speaking. So yeah, it's close. It's not like Nixon and Kennedy. It's not down to tiny margins. But William Jennings Bryan did better than you might have expected. Okay. But we have this thing called the Electoral College, which usually washes out a lot of contention. And so you can see, it's really not even close. McKinley wins the Electoral College vote with 61%. He's got 271 votes to 176. So it's a blowout. All right. So the Democrats lose. That means the populists lose. And that has enormous long-term consequences, right? All right. And this is something worth pausing over. And it's something that I pause over with my students, because they're ready to just bury the populists, which they weren't interested in the first place, and move on. And I say, okay, yes, the populists lose. But let's talk about that for a second. Why does that matter? Why do elections matter, right? Because they have consequences. And in this case, it had a really devastating effect for farmers. So when the populists fuse themselves with the Democrats, as I was saying earlier, they are putting all their eggs in the Democratic Party basket. Well, the Democrats lose. Now, the Democrats are going to be back in 4 years. They're going to have another shot at it in 1900 and 1904 and on from there. But the populists are not, all right? They have lost their separate identity as a political rebel. And so when they've lost that, they're not really that different anymore. The Democrats are now saying things the populists were saying. So the populists collapse, and in effect, they will disappear, all right? There will still be an official populist party that will go on, but it's tiny. It's just, it's a fragment of what it once was. It's not a force on the national scale, right? Why does that matter? I always ask my students that. Why does that matter? because the populists were there for a reason, right? They were there to help the farmers. When the populists disappear, who's going to help the farmers? Turns out nobody. And that's one of the great consequences that come out of this, that there's no effort at Texas or really the national level to help farmers who are losing their farms, who are being sharecroppers, who are being exploited by pretty much everybody all the way up and down, left and right. That continues. And in fact, tenant farming continues to go up. More and more people are losing their land, becoming sharecroppers, getting poorer and poorer. I mean, these problems with cotton continue. Nobody solves the problem of cotton. All right, so that's the major result. And then my students are like, okay, so we're done now, right? That's the last of it. That's the last outcome. I say, no. There's one other outcome that's super important, and that's really important to tie it into the collapse of the populace and really the end of this whole period we've been talking about, is that the creation of Jim Crow begins in legal form, really in this late 19th century, leading into the early 20th century period. So as we've been saying this entire time, this is the era where everything happens at once. But everything's connected to each other. So it's not that just things are happening next to each other. It's that they're affecting each other and connecting to each other. And that's one of the big themes, I hope, of this web series for everybody, is that all these different pieces are connected in really powerful ways. And you don't have one without all the others. All right. And Jim Crow, the establishment of Jim Crow is a really good example. All right. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the early establishment of Jim Crow during this period. Again, this is, I think, crucially important for us to be able to frame correctly and accurately for our students. Now, I don't know about yours, but my students usually assume that Jim Crow just was invented right after the Civil War and that all these laws got put on the books immediately following the defeat of the Confederacy. And that's not quite the story. Now, all the ex-Confederate states, like Texas here, did pass things that we often call today black codes, which were laws restricting the rights or just denying rights at all to African Americans of all kinds. A lot of those got struck down for all kinds of reasons during Reconstruction. The U.S. Congress being charged of Reconstruction, military rule in Texas, struck down a lot of that stuff, not all of it, but a lot of it. And then the new state constitution of Texas, the 1869 one, and then later the 1876 one, didn't have that built into it in that kind of way. Because we have the other thing that happened is there was the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African Americans, and then the 15th Amendment, which said you could not stop people from voting on account of color, race, and previous condition of servitude. So those laws weren't on the books in places like Texas for the most part. And the other reason is that in most Texas communities, you didn't need a whole lot of laws to tell people where they could and couldn't go, or what they could and couldn't do, because everybody who lived there knew where white people were allowed to go and where black people were allowed to go and not allowed. But something changes a lot of that and puts new stresses on the system that will help lead to segregation laws. And again, we're back to one of these major themes, the effects of the railroad. We've seen the railroad expanding things west, making it possible for the cattle drives, the end of the Plains Indians, and the expansion of cotton. Well, now one of the things it's doing is it's bringing people to Texas in those huge numbers. This is, the railroads are bringing people in. And when they do, they're bringing new people who are moving into new communities. As Chassidy said so rightly, there's a lot of African Americans who are coming from Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and are moving to Texas. All right. And when they move in, people moving into new areas don't know the local rules about who's allowed to go where and sort of stuff. So it gets to be a lot of discomfort in some Texas communities about, do we need some official rules and laws to regulate who's going where? But the big thing that leads to segregation laws in Texas really is the railroad. And I'll explain why. So the railroad, as you guys know, likes to make money. That's why they're gouging the farmers for as much money as they can on shipping cotton. Well, they also make money selling tickets for people traveling. And the railroad would have a first-class car and then a coach car. And the railroad was very happy to let anyone who wanted to sit in first class pay the higher dollar amount for first class. That was often white people, but it wasn't always white people. Sometimes African Americans had enough money and would much prefer to sit in nicer circumstances. And so African Americans would sometimes pay for the first class ticket, which made some of the white people in the first class cars uncomfortable, and they would complain. You know what the railroad said? Well, that's tough, but you know what? They paid the money and we wanted the profit, and so that's how it's going to be. So the first segregation laws that really get on the books are the state being asked to force the railroads to have separate cars. All right, this actually happens first in Louisiana in 1887. Louisiana passes a law that forces railroads to have separate cars for white passengers and black passengers in first class or in coach. And then Texas, well, white Texans think that's a really good idea. And then in 1889, they pass a very similar law that first segregates people by space in Texas with the railroad cars. All right. And the state had to force that on the railroads because the railroads didn't want to do it. It wasn't profitable, but it works. And this begins that period of separating, all right, by physical space. But the big thing that happens during this period is suppressing voting. And that's directly tied to the rise and success of the Populist Party. Because the Populists, as you guys remember, as I said a little earlier, were a biracial coalition, right? You have black farmers and white farmers working together, being a part of all of this, right? Well, the Democrats in Texas saw all that and didn't want it happening again. When the Populists collapsed, one of the big lessons the Democratic Party has learned is that you can't have poor white farmers and poor black farmers banding together again and challenging the system. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to crack down on these guys voting, basically. The problem they have is that we have the 15th Amendment, which says you cannot just tell someone they can't vote simply because of their race. It doesn't say you can't find other ways to prevent people from voting. That's the problem with the way the 15th Amendment had been written. So the southern states, and it's the entire South, but Texas is in the lead of doing this, they come up with all kinds of new shenanigans to try to prevent people from voting. And this is a direct outgrowth of these political challenges that happened during the populist period, right? One of the most effective of this is something called the poll tax, right? And this is a receipt you can see from Alabama from 1886. And the poll tax is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tax that you were expected to pay in order to vote at the polls. And so you can see it right here. It's a poll tax of $1.50. There's an assessor's fee and a collector's fee of 50 cents each. So you'd owe $2.50, right? Here's the thing. Why is this effective? Because farmers are poor, really poor. That's the whole point of this populist movement, right? They can't afford anything. So an extra $2.50 it's either that or feed your family for a month, right? They can't afford to do that. So it uses poverty as a way of taking out people from voting, all right? That will disproportionately affect African Americans, but it will also take lots of poor whites out from voting who can't afford this, all right? So that turns out to be very effective in Texas, but it's not enough. They find lots of other ways to prevent people from voting, right? A lot of southern states like Texas transitioned to something called the secret ballot, or it was often called the Australian ballot back then. And that's where you go into a voting booth. Like, you guys see this cartoon right here? This guy's in the voting booth on the right. That's how we usually think of American democracy, right? You go in, you vote, nobody else knows what you're doing. You get to speak your conscience, and it's a very private affair, voting in the 21st century today, right? That's not how voting was before this. Voting used to be done in public, out in front of everybody. You'd get out there and you'd yell out the name of who you wanted to vote for, or you had this entire ticket that was colored for your party, and you would give them the ticket. It was like a straight line vote for everybody, for the Democrats or the Republicans or whoever you were voting for. But southern states like Texas moved during this period to the secret ballot. Why? Well, the reason is if you go in by yourself, you have to be able to read in order to vote. Because no one's in there showing you the names. No one's in there reading them to you. There's no colors that can show it to you. You have to be able to read. And so they're counting on people who can't read being disenfranchised by not being able to go to the voting booth, which again, they hope will disproportionately affect African American voters, right? But that's not even the most effective thing they come up with. The most effective thing they come up with is something called the literacy test, which was invented in Mississippi in the early 1890s. And it proves to be so effective that it's brought to Texas, I think it's 1902 or 1903. And the literacy test is, again, kind of what it sounds like. It's a test that says to vote, you need to be literate, but we have to have someone test you to see if you're literate. So the idea is you go down to the registrar's office, and then this guy who has a pistol in his hand for some reason is going to test if you're literate. And he'll give you the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence and have you read it. The trick here is that he gets to decide if you're literate. So you could read it. And if you're African American, you might be able to read it perfectly, but he'll just say, nope, you can't read. And he gets to decide. And there's no way to contest it. Or he could have a poor white guy show up who can't read at all or can barely read, and he'll say, yes, this person can read. It basically gives this guy right here with the gun all the authority to decide who gets to read, or sorry, who gets to vote, who does not get to vote, with this idea that we're testing their literacy. What we're really doing is deciding who's going to get to vote, who isn't. The reason this matters is this guts voting in places like Texas. So I used to run a digital lab at the University of Richmond, and we did all kinds of experiments with mapping. And this is an image from one of the maps we did of a presidential voting. And I've got it here for 1920 because it shows you, look at the South right here. This is after Texas has passed laws like this, but so has Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the entire South. It is just gutted of voting. African Americans aren't voting because they can't, but poor whites aren't voting either because they can't. It just disembowels voting on a massive scale. You can literally see it. What I find fascinating about this is, like, look at North Carolina. It's different. I don't know what's going on in North Carolina, but they didn't pass the same laws. You can literally see the difference in laws between Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina. If you look out here at Texas, absolutely everything is gutted left and right, right? This is a reaction to the 1890s and all these political revolts and trying to maintain power. The Democratic Party in Texas is trying desperately to cling to power and prevent that kind of challenge from coming back to them, right? But the final part of Jim Crow is something else that you guys all know, which is the violence that comes with Jim Crow, right? There's all these laws that are passed that says who can go where and that sort of stuff. But this is also the era of spectacle lynching and public violence where people are murdered in public, like this gentleman right here, the guy on the scaffold right there, his name is Henry Smith, who was killed in 1893 in Paris, Texas, in front of a crowd you can see here of thousands of people. And what had happened to Henry Smith, I tell the story in my class all the time. It's a very dark, horrific tale. I'm sure you guys can't tell it in 7th grade to your students. So I won't go through all the great details right here. But, you know, he'd been accused of basically stepping out of line as he was in the white community, and he paid the ultimate price. He was tortured to death in front of a massive crowd of people. We know this because we have all these photographs. But the Dallas Morning News actually sent a reporter to watch this entire thing and reported on it. If you go in the archives of the Dallas Morning News, it describes the entire event, calling it, quote, the most horrible death ever inflicted on a human being. And I say that simply to say that the outcomes of all these processes that we're talking about, the massive immigration of so many people into Texas, the growth of the railroads, the destruction of the American Indians, the rise of the cattle industry, the explosion of cotton, and yet the collapse of its prices that put all these people in terrible circumstances that leads to this political revolt had long-term consequences in ways that are sometimes obvious and make sense, in some ways don't. But they're all important because they set up 20th century Texas, when Texas transforms once again. Because in 1900, there are 3 million people, white people, African Americans, Mexican Americans, who have inherited all of this, who are now going to turn to a new era in Texas history. Because 1 year later, in 1901, oil is going to get discovered at Spindletop. And Texas will enter an entirely new phase in its history. So I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to hand the microphone over to my friend Jay, who's going to walk you guys through some more resources.
All right, thank you, thank you. So my portion has always been kind of a battle to, you know, how do we teach this? How do we bring this into it? So The lesson plan is pretty concise. During my research, I did find a couple of things that I did not expect to find, and that's one of the first hook activities that I've come across, to where the state of Texas basically tells the counties and the cities that you guys can go ahead and start to enforce segregation of black and whites. It was really fascinating to read this to where it comes out to where it's telling cities to actively do this. And I've got a couple guided questions down there. I actually, because I'm getting closer to this particular unit, I'm actually just pulling this section 1 and inserting it into one of my existing PowerPoints that I have, and just have 1 or 2 guiding questions be a turn and talk activity for my kids. So this is, to me, it was just mind blowing to see that the state actually did an ordinance, which I'm not surprised, because this was a mass segregation, separate but equal concept of what they were trying to get across. Then I brought in Jim Crow and his lasting impact, just kind of follow what Dr. Torget had been talking about this evening, just really kind of giving the cotton piece, the rise of Jim Crow. And again, you may already have something in place with this, but this is just a very short and concise, but it also gives you information that if you need to pull something out, Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson, that you can add to your existing presentation. That's what this is really designed to. And I jump in on disenfranchisement a little bit with this, talk about poll taxes. Have not found a good image of a Texas one during this era. I found a 1945 poll tax receipt that I've used in other presentations, and then talk a little bit about other forms of disenfranchisement, the literacy tests and whatnot, secret ballots, and then the tensions with the Ku Klux Klan, the lynchings, and the race riots, and discovered something on the Red Summer of 1919 with soldiers coming back from World War I. In Longview was the second of 25 race riots across the United States, where Black leaders were urged Black farmers to take their cotton directly to Galveston and bypass the local gin in Longview. And I didn't realize this, but there was a massive shots fired, houses burned, sections of the Black side of town lost their homes and whatnot. State Guard was sent in, and they were put underneath martial law for a time being. Ultimately, 21 Black men were arrested, sent to Austin for their safety, and then 9 whites were charged with arson, but nobody ever went to trial as a result of this. So I found that really kind of fascinating. That brings it right back to Texas history. And then we talk about the end of segregation, but I also wanted to tie in Mexican Americans as well in Texas, how they were just kind of ostracized because of the color of their skin. And then the last thing that I threw out here is a segregation Texas. I wanted to kind of bring in some images, set the stage, some background, some context for the kids, have short background information. And then I brought in, and I did something different this time, because I know last couple of conversations we've talked about the language, the low reading levels and whatnot. So I decided to do something one different, a one-off. So I pulled the 1891 Act that segregated Black and white passengers through the Texas Railroad Commission, and just got the meat of what this act is much longer, obviously, and I just wanted to grab some meat to it. And then I said, let me level it down to maybe a 5th grade reading level, and to see if that is something, do I lose context from it? And I was really surprised that by taking this information here and then leveling it down to a 5th grade reading level, how much easier the text was able to come across. And I just started recently doing that in my class, because I've got some English language learners that are having a difficult time with some of this primary source material. And I was surprised that it did not dilute it too much. So I did that for the rest of the document. So, and then I have a story here of African Americans that were traveling from, I believe it was up north coming down. And once they hit Longview, they were kicked out of their first class accommodations. And it just really kind of talks about discrimination. So it gives an African American's perspective of separate but equal. And then I also leveled it as well too. And then This is a newspaper article, 1895. It's basically saying in the Galveston Daily News. Galveston Daily News, if you want to find something, those folks typically are printing it right around the turn of the century, and the portal has a really good wealth of information. But this is really just kind of talking about some of the things that were coming down the pipe as it relates to segregation. And now this is one of the first mentions that I've come across to where we start to see separate train rooms for public places at train stations. Also, we're going to start to see places, commonality places where individuals are go to socialize is also going to be segregated. And then on the bottom of the lesson plan, I wanted to give you, Chassidy gave you a bonus last week. I'm going to give you a bonus when we did some work together before. We really talked about during Reconstruction. There is a lesson at the very bottom of this called Jim Crow laws and the impact they had on African Americans. And this lesson has everything from hook activities from the 14th, 15th Amendment, primary sources, the impact. There's an extension. The extension is what Chassidy was talking about earlier. I had fun with this about a year ago doing this, the freedmen colonies. And one of the best freedmen colonies that I've run across is, and I put this link in there too, it's called Vision of Harmony, Grants Colony in East Texas, to where they did some research and found this colony and found some oral research and whatnot, but it's a really cool little way of bringing stuff back home. And Chassidy's right. This is the forgotten piece of history. No one talks about it anymore. So it's starting to resurface again. But there's also a little activity that talks about settlements. One in South Houston, I believe it's the 4th or 5th ward. Chassidy can correct me if ward is where it's at. But it's in where gentrification has pretty much swallowed it up, as well as a couple of other ones. So these are additional resources for you that you can pick and choose, slice and dice. The intent behind all of this stuff is you see a formalized presentation. It's not, you don't have to use that. You pick and choose what you want. I do that all the time, and the intent is just to help enrich these kids so they see that there's a history out there that is beyond the textbook, and we're giving voice to these people as well too. So with that, to give enough time to do a final wrap up, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Torget. I'll throw my email in the chat here in a little bit. So I've got a ton of resources. I know Chassidy has a ton of resources. If you're looking for something, just email us. We'll send it to you. This stuff is good stuff. Bottom line, we want to give you every resource you have available to yourself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Torget.
Okay. Thank you, Jay. Thank you. All right, guys. Well, we have covered a lot of territory.